Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to probably just kick us off here so we can keep our program on time, guys. I'm Eric Connor. I know most of y'all here. I'm with Vino Coterie, and I see a few fresh faces here. So I want to take a second and just tell you about the Vino Coterie story, knowing that doing that gets us, we need to get into the wine first. So there are 5 partners in Vino Coterie, and we share 3 things in common. So first of all, we are all DFW based, deep roots here. And so the point of that is when we started this concept, we wanted to invest and start in our community. And that's what we're doing, which is why most of this is local call here. The second is that we are all entrepreneurs. We've owned many businesses, operated many businesses, and this is an entrepreneurial venture of ours. So just know that when you buy from us, you are investing in a local small business. And for that, we're very grateful. And third, and arguably most important, we all have a passion for wine. Hence Vino Coterie. Coterie means a community of like-minded or shared interest. And simply put, Vino Coterie is here to be your one-stop source for wine. But equally important, we want to create a wine experience, which is kind of what this event is about. And we do that in 4 ways. So the first is our e-shop platform. So if you go on to our website and you'll hit the shop button, you'll see 150 to 200 wines, all price points, all 10 to 15% off of retail, and roughly 30% of those you'll be able to find at your Total Wine or your Specs or something like that. But intentionally, the other 70% you may not find in retail, nor may you find in Texas, because we're targeting boutique vineyards, family-owned vineyards, storylines, something with the story about it, so it creates a different experience for you. So go on the site, order 1 bottle, 3 bottles, 12 bottles, shipped to your house, nice packaging, all that kind of stuff. The second platform we have is our membership options. So we have 4 options ranging from $75 a month to $215 a month. And with that, you get 3 different bottles shipped to you every month, depending upon your taste and profile. And they will come, again, in the nice packaging. And included in that will be a tasting card that has some notes about the bottles that are in the package, their story. And of course, if you like those and you tried those experience, you click the little QR button and you can buy them more at our e-shop. So that's our membership platform. The third option we offer is, let's call it our concierge suite, which is corporate gifts, holidays, other events. Ship a bottle to your clients or customers with a personalized tasting note. Help us fill your wine cellar, help us start your wine collection, or something as simple. If you're at a restaurant, you find a bottle that you like, shoot any one of us a picture. We had it happen twice last week, and it's a complete win-win for both of us because we have access to over 20,000 different wines. You're going to get a wine unquestionably cheaper than you had at the restaurant and cheaper than you had at retail. We get exposure to wines that maybe we haven't experienced before, and we can add it to our website. So it's a great process for us. And the fourth kind of experience we're trying to create is events, whether it's tastings at our showroom Grapevine or in-home tastings at your house with family and friends, or a virtual happy hour. And this is clearly a virtual happy hour. And the key component of a virtual happy hour is to have an educational piece. And we've knocked it out of the park today with Marcus from Stag's Leap, who makes the wine. So with that said and done, you should have the 3 wines in front of you. You should have a tasting card, look something like this, through a link that Aaron sent you. If you don't, I'll monitor the chat log on the right throughout it. We'll email it to you or get it to you. But we can't hold these events without partners. And we have a very special partner in Guy Young from Republic. And I'll turn it over to you to kind of get our show started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. So yes, my name's Ga-Young Kim. You've probably seen me in the past virtual tastings as well. So thank you for hosting me. And thank you so much for Marcus for joining in on this call. This is so cool to have you on board. But yeah, I'll leave it to you because these are your wines.
Sure. Well, hey, it's a pleasure to be with everybody and kind of walk you through a little bit of the stories and the history of Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, and I'll walk you through the wines. And listen, you certainly don't need to wait for me though to taste the wines. You know, go ahead and get your wines open if they're not. Listen, it's 6 o'clock where you guys are at. It's 4 o'clock where I'm at, but I have my glass of Sauvignon Blanc already. You don't need to wait for me. But I thought first, you know, it's kind of a interesting time in the vineyards here in Napa Valley. I brought you something to show you that you don't see very often in the vineyards, but we right now are going through what is called bloom. And you can see those little white flowers on this cluster. You have the little green things, and then as I kind of rotate this thing around, you can see these little flowers. So this is like one of the real key times for viticulture. It really kind of sets up the crop, sets up the season. You know, you guys were talking a little bit about hail and things like that. If right now we were to get like bloom is happening and it's happening like really quick, and if we were to have like a rainstorm come through here right now, or some other like extreme temperatures or a hailstorm or anything like that, it'll knock these little flowers like right off, or they won't set. So each one of these little flowers, they actually like self-pollinate. So assuming each one of these gets pollinated right now, then you'll have a little grape. So in years where we've had more crazy weather during bloom, for example, in 2020, and before that in 2015, we had rain like right now and cold temperatures. It was wild. And those were years that we wound up with two things. One, a much smaller crop because not as many of these little things were able to pollinate. And also you wind up with more variability. So if this process of getting all these flowers out and pollinated happens in a short time, that's good, because that means you're going to have a lot of really nice uniformity for the rest of the season as to how those grapes develop. But if we have some wild and crazy weather, cold temperatures, wind, and this winds up taking like a long time, then you'll wind up seeing it at other different times during the growing season. For example, you know, with red grapes, you know, a key marker is called veraison. It's when the grapes turn from being green to being purple. And that can take place really quick if everything is nice and uniform. And it can take place really slow if the bloom, which is happening right now, takes a long time. So what you'll wind up with in that case at harvest is you're going to have on the same cluster, you might have grapes that are perfectly ripe, maybe overripe that are turning into raisins, and are green berries at the same time. So that's why during this time of the year, we want really good weather. Like right today, it was about 90 degrees. It's a little windy. It's pretty warm at night. We've had one of these kind of north wind events come through here, but it's perfect conditions for bloom. And I want the weather is supposed to hold like this. We're supposed to cool off a little bit, you know, be like in the 80s, which for us in May is normal, like low 80s and 50s at night. That's like perfect bloom weather. So I'm crossing my fingers. This is what we want. That this is an important part of the growing season. And again, it kind of sets us up for later on. And you know, we'll talk about again how we make the wines and what I'm looking for. But really, one of the biggest keys in making wine is viticulture, and being able to recognize all the different parts of the season. As a winemaker, you don't just like go out into the field and pick the grapes and then that's it, right? You have to be actually actively involved all season long to see little things like this so that you can react. I mean, we got to react to Mother Nature every year. We got warm years, we got cold years. We have, you know, depends on what happens during bloom. Yeah, and then you react. You don't farm the same way every year. We had a really dry winter here this year. And so we're changing how we farm to react to that. So in a normal season, we maybe would till our soil like every other row. This year, it's like we're tilling our soil like every row so that we can lock in all the moisture we've got, give as many nutrients to those vines as we can. And then the timing of other viticulture aspects too. In a dry year like this, we want to remove any little shoots and leaves that aren't important so that we can like concentrate the energy of the vine. So it's a fun time to be outside right now. It's a real critical time. These little flowers, believe it or not, when there's enough of them in bloom, the vineyards actually have a sweet smell when you walk through. And again, it's something that only happens like for, you know, if it's good weather, right? This whole process takes about a week or so. So it's, anyway, wish you were out here to see it or to come walk through. It doesn't happen for long. But onto the wines or the winery. You know, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars has a, you know, a fantastic history in Napa Valley. You know, we were founded in 1970 by Warren Bernarski. So last vintage, 2020, we celebrated as best as we could our 50th anniversary. Couldn't pick a worse freaking year to celebrate your 50th anniversary. You know, Warren, he was a college professor who, in the mid 60s, he was working on the University of Chicago, but he went up with his family on a sabbatical to Italy, and that's where he caught what we call in the wine industry the wine bug. He fell in love with viticulture and wanted to get into the production end, so he moved his family out to Napa Valley. He worked as an assistant winemaker for Mondavi when they were first built, for Souverain, but really he was looking for land for himself. And in 1969, he paid a visit to Mr. Nathan Fay, who was there in the top left of your screen. Mr. Fay was a pioneer here in Stag's Leap. He was the first person to plant Cabernet Sauvignon in the Stag's Leap district. He planted the Fay Vineyard in 1961. And at that time, there was no vineyard south of Rutherford, like 5 miles to the north of us, and really only about 700 acres of Cabernet Sauvignon planted in the whole valley. So, but Mr. Fay, he sold his grapes to Heights, Inglenook, Sequoia Grove, but he also made a little bit of homemade wine. And that is what, when Mr. Winiarski paid him a visit, that's what they tasted. So, and as Warren says it, as soon as Nathan popped open the bottle of homemade Cabernet and the aromas started to come off the bottle and fill up the room, that was his like aha moment. Like, these are the flavors, these are the characters I've been looking for in great Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. And then there so happened to have been 40 acres of land for sale directly to the south of Mr. Fay's property. Like, the property lines actually abut each other. And that was, the land was mostly planted to prunes. And, you know, at that time in the 70s, you know, prunes were more valuable than wine grapes in the Napa Valley. They looked very, very different. You know, there were only 30 wineries here at the time. But Mr. Winiarski purchased that land, planted Cabernet Sauvignon, and then you got to fast forward. And so our first vintage would have been 1972. We made a little bit of Cabernet from that vineyard, and he named that vineyard SL, or Stag's Leap Vineyard, or SLV for short. But you got to go then the next step, 4 years later, 1976, and you got to go over to Paris, France. That's where a British wine merchant named Stephen Spurrier, he had a wine shop in Paris, and he noticed that there were some Americans and Brits that were working around his wine shop, visiting his wine shop. And Mr. Spurrier and his partner, or Patricia Gallagher, they had visited Napa and had seen what was happening. Like, there was this emergence happening in Napa Valley. They were quite excited about the wines, and they thought that they could sell these wines to these folks that were visiting their wine shop. But of course, at this time in the mid 70s, I mean, California wine was completely unheard of. And really, when you're talking about quality wine, there's only one place in the world that was thought of for producing really great quality wine. That, of course, is France, Burgundy, and Bordeaux. So to try to get some, you know, recognition for these New World wines, Mr. Spurrier organized a tasting, and he brought in or invited in about 20, you know, renowned French wine judges, and invited them for a tasting of these wines from the New World. And then when they arrived, he asked if it was okay to put in some wines from Burgundy and Bordeaux and do the tasting blind. And the judges all agreed. And so they started, of course, with the Chardonnays, the Burgundies. And again, nobody knew what was what, but Mr. Spurrier had put in some of the most renowned Burgundies and Bordeaux into this tasting. And then when the results were revealed, it was the 1973 Chateau Montelena Chardonnay that had won in the Burgundy category. Of course, Montelena is right up the road here, up in Calistoga. And then when they tasted the Bordeaux wines, so the Cabernet wines, it was the Stag's Leap Wine Cellars 1973 Cabernet Sauvignon that had beaten the best of Bordeaux. So Mr. Spurrier had invited, you know, a whole bunch of media to come cover this event. and none of them showed up. And so at the last second, he made a phone call over to Time Magazine, who sent a man named George Tabor over. And Mr. Tabor wrote this little article that appeared on page like 56 of Time Magazine, across from like a Roger Staubach tire commercial. But that little article kind of documenting this incredible victory of the Americans over what the French were most known for got picked up by news organizations around the world. The title of the article was The Judgment of Paris. It was kind of like that going viral moment of the 70s, and it was exploded. And for the viticulturists, for winemakers in Napa Valley, it was a real defining moment. It kind of showed that what they had believed in was right, that we could produce world-class grapes here, and in particular gave the Valley then some direction that yes, we can produce world-class Chardonnay, we can produce world-class Cabernet Sauvignon. You know, this at this time, Napa was, you know, it wasn't really the Disneyland that it is today. And you know, people were still kind of experimenting. You should see our labels from the 70s. We were making, you know, Alicante Boucher and Gewürztraminer and Rieslings, things like that. And the Paris tasting really is like, okay, this is a world-class place for Chardonnay, world-class place for Cabernet Sauvignon. You know, when you visit us here, and we are open again, both inside and outside now, we have, you know, a bottle of the 73 on display. We have a lot of the judges' notes, and it's a pretty proud part, I guess, of our history. And maybe what a lot of us here think is maybe even the most cool is there's an exhibit back at the Smithsonian in DC entitled "The Things That Made America." And so there's things like Alexander, like the telephone, right? And Neil Armstrong's like spacesuit is there. And there's a bottle of Montelena Chardonnay and a bottle of our Cabernet Sauvignon SLV 73. That's part of that. And anyway, we think
hey, Marcus.
cool. Yep.
If you don't mind, I had a question, and I also, you know, you said the name of the author. I've been trying to tell Eric for the longest time that I have like deep ties in the wine business, and that's why, you know, we needed to get this rolling. I've been telling you, Eric. You heard the last name. Can you repeat that for him, Marcus? For
the author, it's George Tabor.
Okay. Can we move this event on a little bit? But by the way, Marcus, I still have a suit like he's wearing in my closet. So
yeah. Well, Mr. Spurrier, George Tabor, he actually did write a book called The Judgment of Paris, where he documents all the backstories behind that tasting and the wineries. And you know what? It's a wine book, but it's actually like really interesting. Like you'll read it, and it actually is really cool. It's got a lot of great historical notes for what's happening in Napa and all the details behind the tasting. And Mr. Spurrier, he actually just passed away, maybe a month ago or so. But he also wrote a book before his passing called Life of Wine, and that actually is the cover of it, I believe. And he signed a copy and sent it to me, and I haven't had a chance to delve into it yet. But you know, listen, history is an important part of wine. You know, a lot of people age wines, and it's fun to open them up, you know, for a special event or a special anniversary. And certainly a lot of history here.
So I had
real quick.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Before my St. Michel days, in my previous wine broker life, I did the same tasting, and we did it blind. It was for a pharmaceutical group. And the wine that won was it wasn't the same vintage, of course, but 2013 SLV won the night. And it was up against Aubryon. It was up against with Lieuvel Lascaux. I mean, yeah, it's the wine. I mean, it shows how amazing this wine is.
That's awesome. So Marcus, I had two quick questions. One was the bottle that's shown on the screen here and the bottle that's at the Smithsonian. How many of those 1973 SLVs are in existence? And also you were talking about the Valley at the time in the 70s, and you gave like from Rutherford, was that from Rutherford south towards Napa that was undeveloped, or kind of where did the development really start? And then where did it kind of migrate to? Was it south to north in the Valley, or kind of north to south?
That's a really good question. The first question, we have about a case of 73 left here. You know, how much is out as far as collectors go, it's tough to say. I last tasted the wine over maybe about a year and a half ago or so. Mr. Winiarski still lives here on the property, and he was being honored at an event sponsored by the Smithsonian. He was given an award, the Bicentennial Award, and out of his personal collection, he brought down 3 bottles, which we got a chance to open and taste a very small amount, but got a chance to taste it. Still is full of life, has a lot of flavors of SLV, Stag's Leap Vineyard, which has this dusty cocoa powder and currant character and tobacco and real lively fruit and acidity. And yeah, actually, with the valley and how it was planted, I mean, that's actually a great segue into talking a little bit about the wines and the valley, because Napa Valley is such a small place. It's only 30 miles long by 5 miles wide, but the weather really changes depending on where you're at. We have this great big air conditioner to the south of us called San Pablo Bay, and then you have this heat, a lot of heat in the valleys to the east of Napa. So like the Sacramento Valley, where a lot of stuff is grown, a lot of food is grown. But in the early afternoons, the rising heat from the east of us, it gets freaking hot over there. That starts to pull in these cool sea breezes then off the Pacific Ocean. These sea breezes come in through like the Golden Gate Bridge, go across San Pablo Bay, and then turn north. So they fill up the valley from the south to the north. And then that's what happens typically at night, right? And then the next morning, sun comes out and the fog burns off then from the north back out to the south and back out into the ocean. And then we get, then the sun, then the sun's out, so we get quite warm. And then this thing, it kind of repeats itself again. So depending on where you are in the valley from just where you are, has a big impact over whether you're a warmer area or a colder area. Then the soils make things even more complicated. So back in the 70s, I mentioned there was no Cabernet Sauvignon planted south of Rutherford. The dividing line was the city of Yountville. I don't know how many of you folks have been out here, but Yountville is directly to the next town up from where we're sitting here at Stag's Leap. But it was thought that Yountville and south was for white varieties. White varieties, especially like Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, these other things, they prefer more coolness, right? And then Yountville North was thought to be for red varieties. So that's why back when in 61, so even before that, again, there's only 700 acres of Cabernet. There was Cabernet planted all around the different parts of the valley, but it was a little bit more geographically, you had, again, white varieties south, just red varieties that were just planted to the north. It takes a while to kind of learn your area. And so Mr. Fay, when he planted Cabernet here, he was definitely kind of taking a risk. But it was obviously paid off. The Stag's Leap district then, which today is an appellation and a sub-appellation of the Napa Valley and the smallest. So we are only about 3 miles long by 1 mile wide. And we're about 5 miles then north of the city of Napa, just south of Yountville, and tucked into the eastern hills and surrounded by these rocky outcroppings. So we're kind of in this bowl. Again, I wish the Wi-Fi was working outside to show you. But the picture behind kind of is a good representation of what we're surrounded by. The area has historically been known as Stag's Leap. And the reason for that is back when the Native Americans were kind of living and hunting in our valley, they used to chase the deer up into the rocks in order to hunt them. And there's a legend that a particularly large stag, if you can go back one slide, made it to the top, that big rocky outcropping with the V cut there, made it to this, in order to escape, made it to one part of that V cut and then leapt that incredible distance to the other side in order to escape. So that's how our area then was historically known as Stag's Leap. And then of course, when Warren, planted the Stag's Leap Vineyard, then the winery, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. Of course, at the same time, there was another winery, Stag's Leap Winery, that was founded that resulted in lots more confusion, which we can talk about later on if you guys want. But when they did the actual measurements, they found that because we're in this bowl and the reflective heat off of these rocks, we do and the fog lingers here. It sits here until about 9:30 in the morning. When you drive to work here in the summertime, you're like, God, where am I going? It's foggy and cold. But when the fog does burn off, that reflective heat, it heats up in the bowl here, and we get just as warm as they do in your traditional warmer appellations like St. Helena or Calistoga. But we are south, so then the sea breezes come in around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then the fog, of course, rolls in later on in the night. So we have this real beautiful temperature difference, nice warm days, which brings out the nice ripe flavors in Cabernet Sauvignon. But that extended cooling period really helps to like lock in acidity and color, and kind of gives the Stag's Leap Cabernet this, what I call this soft power. They're ripe, complex wines, but they don't tend to be too over the top, too heavy, and they have just this incredible potential for ageability. So the
Marcus, you mentioned the sub-appellation. How geographically, how large can they be, or is that not the way to ask the question? Because it depends on the mountain range and how it cuts. How is that decided?
Well, to be an AVA, or that's an American Viticulture appellation, there actually are several components to do it. You actually have to you have to come up with get a bunch of paperwork, right? And then agree on a bunch of things. Then you apply to the federal government to be recognized as an appellation. But among the things, one is you have to prove that the name has historical significance. So that's where Stag's Leap, because our area with the rocks had always been known as Stag's Leap and was referred to that on maps, going back 100 years. So you have to prove that the name has historical significance. You have to have defined boundaries, and some of that you want to be able to prove that there's a difference when you go outside of your boundary, whether it's because the soil type changes, or some appellations have been defined by elevation, or some frankly have been defined just by roads and stuff like that. Stag's Leap is pretty well defined. It's more of a soil type change when you get outside of the region. But then you also have to prove, why are the wines, or why are the grapes, why is the area distinct and uniquely different from other areas? So it's a multi-step process that you have to show, you have to petition. It gets a little bit political. There actually is a great book. There's another great wine book, but it's actually also an interesting wine book. It's by Richard Mendelson. It's called Appellation Napa Valley. It's the whole story of how the different sub-appellations of Napa, the whole, why and what, and all of the why was this boundary in this location and not at that location. And it is if you think about your neighbors to the south, the person that's right on the outside of that appellation, they want to be in the appellation because, especially if it's a well-known appellation, but should they be in the appellation? What's the soil type? What are the wines like? So it's a little bit tricky. And remember that there is like Stag's Leap District is a sub-appellation of the Napa Valley. So the Napa Valley is the broad appellation, and then there are sub-appellations within the Napa Valley that are uniquely and distinctly different, like Atlas Peak, Diamond Mountain, Howell Mountain, Rutherford, St. Helena, Calistoga, Mount Veeder, Stag's Leap. That's how it goes. And the appellations, one thing that I mentioned the weather, right? How the weather works here. But the other thing that is so fascinating, it's not just whether you're south or north that defines what you can grow and the characteristics of those grapes, but it's whether you're mountain up in the hills or if you're on the valley floor. Not only are the soils different, but the amount of sunshine you get is different. When you talk about a mountain area like up on Atlas Peak or Howell Mountain, these are areas that the fog is below you. And so you're up in the hills, and so the temperatures are not quite as warm up there. But you're not in the fog, and so you get more sunlight. And it winds up being a little bit warmer at night. So that has a big impact over the flavors and characters you get in grapes. And then obviously the soil types is another huge factor that will define the personalities of the grapes themselves. And there's maybe no better example of that than right here at Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. I mentioned the Fay Vineyard was the vineyard that inspired Warren to buy the land next door. But the Fay Vineyard didn't become actually part of Stag's Leap Wine Cellars until the mid-'80s, when Mr. Fay was ready to retire. Warren bought the vineyard and found that they're very different because of the different soil types. So Stag's Leap Vineyard, SLV, has been planted in a very young soil, recently eroded off of those rocky outcroppings that picture showed you. So the soil out there is very red, it's very coarse, it's very dusty. And SLV Cabernet, Stag's Leap Vineyard Cabernet, has this like dusty cocoa powder, this currants, violets, and richer, more robust tannins. But the Fay Vineyard, which again, it's right next door, so you can walk literally across this little creek and you're in it. But the soil is different. It also has been washed down off of those same rocks. In fact, it's been washed off the rocks in this picture that you're looking at in the distance, and then transported by creeks when we get big rain events. It's been transported then, it's washed down off those rocks, and then transported that. Well, those rock mountains that you're looking at up there, that's like by Schaefer. So off those rocks, and then transported, it's about 2 miles up the road, down by creeks, down and flooded then across where the Fay Vineyard has been planted. So the soil looks really different. It's got more, it's a gray color to it as opposed to being red. It's much more clumpy. It's just simply older, more weathered soil. And the Cabernet from Fay has a different personality. Again, SLV's got this dusty cocoa powder thing going, violets. Fay is more bright fruit, like bright berry pie. It has this real distinct perfumey note to it, and softer, more supple tannins. So all these little things, that's one of the reasons why it's so much fun making wine here in Napa Valley. They all have an influence over the grapes, and you know, you can start your day down at Carneros, which is down in the south, and you're bundled up in a jacket. It's foggy, and but by the time you get to the north, up in Calistoga, which is really, you know, 45-minute drive, you're getting your short sleeves on and finding your shorts and putting on a hat so you don't get sunburned. It's pretty crazy.
Thank you, Marcus. So it looks like we got the Sauvignon Blanc here on the screen.
Yep. Well, let's get started. Again, I hope nobody has been waiting to taste the wines. Hopefully, you've been tasting as I've been rambling on and on. But let's start with the Sauvignon Blanc. You know, we obviously we're known for Cabernet Sauvignon, but we actually have been working with white varieties like Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay really since the late 70s. We have a long history with producing these varieties, and Sauvignon Blanc is one that I think is really fun. You know, it's the first thing that gets ripe here in Napa, and it's the one variety that if you go out in the field and taste the grapes, and then you pick the grapes the next day, if it tastes like a grapefruit in the vineyard and you pick it and then you ferment it, you're going to get grapefruit in the wine. It's like almost like this direct relation. The other grape varieties aren't quite so direct as to what you get. But the style of this wine and the style of actually all three wines that we're going to taste. You know, I talked about the personality of Stag's Leap District Cabernet, which again has this soft power. They're complex wines, which means there's a lot going on when you smell them and you taste them, but they don't tend to be too over the top or too heavy. They're mouth-filling wines. The flavors sit there, they linger, and they last, and they're interesting. And those are the kind of wines we get from Stag's Leap. Frankly, those are the kind of wines that I like to drink. And so I like to have that style be part of our Napa Valley appellation wines as well. So with this wine, the Sauvignon Blanc, we really source it from three key areas. We own a vineyard in the Oak Knoll appellation, which is a little bit to the south of us, and our vineyard is right next to the Napa River. So as you would suspect, the soils there have a little bit more nutrients in them. So it's not quite as hot down there. So it's really not a great location for red varieties, but it's a great location for Sauvignon Blanc and for Chardonnay. And the Chardonnay grown there has got this, or excuse me, Sauvignon Blanc, we'll get to Chardonnay next, has got this real grapefruity, grassy thing going on, a lot of bright natural acidity. So that's one key part. And then we also source grapes. We have a vineyard, a family vineyard we've been working with since the 70s. It's called Rancho Chimilas. Actually, was just out there. Actually, both those vineyards earlier today. And Rancho is in the southeast kind of corner of Napa. They don't get quite as much fog in there. It's a sunnier area. The soils are a little bit more volcanic. So Sauvignon Blanc, then grown in that condition, takes on a little bit more of a riper characteristic. So it has more of a guava note to it and citrus, like a tangerine characteristic. And the other key area, we sourced some Sauvignon Blanc from an old vineyard up in Calistoga, also kind of right next to the Napa River. So a little bit richer soil up there. It's this dry farm, has this crazy looking trellis on it, but it produces this really interesting Sauvignon Blanc. It has like an orange blossom and a kind of a tobacco type note to it. So those are the different flavors that I'm trying to capture when you smell and you taste this wine. I hope you're able to get. And we ferment it though. I ferment this wine actually primarily in older French oak barrels. So I'm not really looking for any wood, you know, in the description of the wine. You know, there's no toasty notes or vanilla or things like that that you would characterize as coming from the wood. And I don't ferment it in barrels for the wood. I ferment it in barrels for the texture. So when you ferment wines in barrels, you know, you leave the wines together with the yeast for, you know, we leave it for about 6 months or so, and we mix up the barrels about once every 2 weeks. And that just adds a little bit more richness and adds a little bit more texture to the Sauvignon Blanc. And then also ferment some Sauvignon Blanc in stainless steel as well. That's where we can keep it nice and cold. Really helps to preserve a lot of the fresh and delicate aromas of Sauvignon Blanc. Keeps the wine really nice and bright. And so when I talk about trying to make a wine that is complete and complex with Sauvignon Blanc, that's how we try to do it. Is I ferment it in some barrels. It helps. I don't want this wine to be one of these Sauvignon Blancs like you taste it and it's zippy and then the flavors are just gone. That's not the kind of wines. I mean, I enjoy those kind of wines, but for this one, I want the flavors to linger in your mouth, be lasting. You can enjoy this wine, and I'm sure you'll have plenty of nice, after your rainstorms are done, you'll have plenty of nice 90-degree summer days coming up. So you can enjoy this wine in Dallas outside, if you know, on a hot day, or you can actually, it has enough going on that you can pair it with a first course with dinner as well. This is a great shellfish wine, a really fun wine to try with oysters or crab or any of those type, like appetizer type things.
So Marcus, we have some side conversations going on here about the taste profile. If I were to pull out the 18 and then upcoming the 20, would I see a distinct difference, or how do you think about, I know it's probably what the grape gives you, but tell us about the vintage differences.
Well, you know, we've had 18 was really a great vintage for both white and red varieties. You know, the summer of 18 was just like classic Napa Valley weather. You know, the sea breeze was rolling all summer long. And the way I know that is I remember, you know, we loved to barbecue in the evening, my wife, my kids, dog. And I remember during the summer of 18, it was me and the dog because everybody else thought it was too cold outside. So, you know, going into harvest of 18, that's like, for white varieties, that's beautiful. And we harvested Sauvignon Blanc and then Chardonnay, and we're really excited about the wines. When you have seasons like that, they're really, really aromatic, really nice, bright acidity. And then we're like, oh crap, you know, we got Cabernet Sauvignon, now we need hang time. And that's what we got though in 18. 18, then we had beautiful weather in September, October, even up to almost the third week of November. We were having high temperatures in the low 80s, you know, upper 70s at night, you know, low 50s, which is just perfect ripening weather for Cabernet Sauvignon. So it really was a vintage of kind of two seasons. 19 was a little more dramatic, at least at time of harvest, where, I mean, as far as like whether it was a warm year or a cool year, it was still kind of on the cooler side. But we actually had some pretty dramatic heat spikes at harvest. And so with Sauvignon Blanc, I think the 19 Sauvignon Blancs are maybe a little bit riper in terms of flavors and maybe not quite as aromatic, let's say, as 18. And not quite as acidic, let's say, as 18, which again is kind of a function of the season, let's say. The 20 we also had, you know, it was a fairly dramatic season in 2020 for lots of different reasons. The 2020 Sauvignon Blanc, you know, we also had a couple of pretty darn high heat spikes when Sauvignon Blanc was still on the vine. And so I feel like if you were to line them up, the most aromatic Sauvignon Blanc is probably going to come from 18. And then 19 and 20 are kind of along the lines. They have a little bit more riper, so a little bit more tropical notes, let's say, and maybe just a touch less acidity when you taste the wines.
Fantastic. Marcus, one more question before we maybe head on to the next one. What Avetta, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Where does that name come from? What's the origin?
Sure. Aveda is a water goddess that's often seen carrying fruit. You know, our vineyard in Oak Knoll, we largely dry farm that. I mentioned the vineyard up in Calistoga that we dry farm. So that's kind of our homage to that, so that we keep things going. But the names of all these wines, I mean, the origin of that, and Aveda, you know, Artemis was the first. We've been producing a Napa Valley Sauvignon Blanc since the late 70s, early 80s, right? We've been producing a Napa Valley Chardonnay. We're going to taste Caria next, again, since the beginning, right? And a Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. But in 2001, Warren changed the name, or gave a proprietary name to the Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, calling it Artemis, which we'll talk about that wine in a little bit. And then later, I think it was 07, when the Napa Valley Chardonnay was given the name Caria. And then it was most recent in 2013 when the Sauvignon Blanc was given the name Aveda. Listen, a big reason for that is just to help with the confusion with Stag's Leap Winery. So I mentioned both wineries were founded at the same time. They were making some like fruit wines, but both rushed to capture this name as a grape winery at the same time. We were first. We have a lower bottom number. But this, you know, both tried to capture this name. This resulted in a 10-year, you know, $1 million confrontation, where the results were, okay, we are Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. You can see where our apostrophe is before the S. They're Stag's Leap Winery with the apostrophe after the S. They were founded by Carl Domani, he loved Petit Syrah. So that's really what they were founded on. But later also started to make some of these other varieties. So on a wine list, though, it's, you know, a lot of restaurant wine lists, you only have so much room, right? So you put, and our name is pretty big. So to put Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, there's lots of times where you're going to find it's just going to be Stag's Leap Cabernet Sauvignon, no apostrophe. So which one is it? Or even if it has the apostrophe, which one is it, right? It's very confusing. We're constantly training wait staff. It's a problem that's probably not going away. We constantly have folks coming in here that have an appointment for the other one. As a winemaker, and their winemakers, this guy named Christophe Colbert, I mean, we think it's funny. I mean, if I had a nickel for every time I've been told how good our Petit Syrah is, I mean, I could buy, I don't know, an acre in Napa Valley. And he'll say, think about how many times he's been told about Artemis or Cask 23. So anyway, that's why we put a proprietary name on them. Now, if it's Stag's Leap Artemis, and that's the only room that you've got, you can at least, it helps, I think, for folks to recognize which winery is what. It certainly helps with Artemis. I mean, when I'm out in normal times and we're out visiting with folks or tasting at tastings, I'll get, hey, where's the Artemis? You know, I don't even know if they know it's Cabernet Sauvignon, but they want the Artemis. And Caria and Aveda are along the same lines.
Hey, Marcus, you mentioned the 20 vintage. Obviously, with the fires this past year, you know, I was in the Valley in October and actually got to see it kind of firsthand. I was just amazed with a lot of the devastation and a lot of the grapes still on the vines. So the wineries that we went to discussed how there's going to be very little production. So were you guys able to get some of those grapes in prior to the fires and the smoke damage that happened?
Well, listen, the 2020 fires were pretty complicated. We actually had learned a lot from the 17 fires, which weren't all that long ago. And, you know, we were able to make some pretty educated decisions as to what to pick and what not to pick. You know, the reality is that just because there's smoke in the air doesn't necessarily mean there's smoke in the grapes. It's a very complicated subject. And in general, grapes that have been approached by fire, meaning, you know, the fire is close to the vineyard, that's where you really wind up with this smoke taint or these elevated levels of smoke that are really difficult to manage. And we were very, very fortunate in that, you know, we are today a joint venture in ownership with the Ancinori family from Tuscany, and then St. Michel, which is based in Washington State. And the St. Michel side, they have labs that can actually do testing. One of the biggest challenges for vintners here in Napa Valley was the fact that the 17 fires really happened at the end of harvest, and was really localized more to Napa. The 2020 fires were both Sonoma and Napa, and it was at the beginning of harvest is when everything started to happen. And so there's really only a few laboratories in this area that can run actual analysis to see how affected the grapes are, so that you can determine whether or not it's a good decision to go ahead and pick. And literally within a week or two after these fires started, the wait times to receive results were, 2 months later. You weren't going to get any analytical data. We were lucky. We've been through this, and we had a lab that could actually give us some data to support also sensory decisions as to whether to go ahead and pick or not. So we do have wines from 2020. We certainly have less wine in 2020 than what we have. Our estate here in Stag's Leap was largely unaffected. So we will be producing some estate wines. White wines were not affected, white grapes and how we handle those. It's the whole key, the smoke compounds are in the skins. And so with white grapes, though, you press the grapes off really quickly and you separate the juice from the skin. So with white grapes, was not really affected. And, with Artemis Cabernet Sauvignon, we definitely have some wines in the house. We also walked away from a lot of grapes, so we won't be making as much. But I think I can speak for Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, but really for other vintners here in the Napa Valley. I mean, the valley here has been based, our wines, our reputation is based on quality, and folks aren't going to be putting wines in the bottle that are affected by smoke taint or aren't of the quality standards that you folks have come to expect. So I don't think there'll be as much wines. There'll be some folks that might not be able to bottle anything. But we had a really, through it all, up until fire started, we had a fantastic growing season going.
Yeah.
I was really, really excited about it in terms of the timing of different viticulture practices, the way the season was going. The vintage actually had a lot of potential. And some of the wines that I have that are clean and are great, I'm be happy to put those in the bottle and drink them.
Yeah.
Marcus, that's great information. We got about 20 minutes left on the call. We want to leave more time for Q&A. So tell us about, there we go. Perfect.
Okay, Caria. So Caria, Greek word meaning graceful. Again, really fits with the style of the wine. Grapes for Caria come from really 4 key areas. That same vineyard in Oak Knoll that we own, Chardonnay that we grow there. That's actually maybe a little bit of a warmer area for Chardonnay for us. You wind up with a lot of these nice apple and melon, kind of your classic, what you would expect in a Napa Valley Chardonnay. We also, Mr. Winarski owns a vineyard in the Coombsville appellation. So for those of you that have been out here, Coombsville is the hills directly to the east of Napa. So southern part of the valley, so cooler area. And the soils in this vineyard it's a dried up freshwater lake. So it's like white, a lot of diatoms. And the Chardonnay from this vineyard is very unique. It has more of like a honeysuckle, floral, flinty characteristics, kind of a white peach character, and really bright natural acidity. It's a very unique vineyard, and we actually do a single vineyard that we bottled here for our wine club, and we just have it available here at the winery. The vineyard's called Arcadia. We also source grapes from Coombsville, or excuse me, from Carneros. Carneros, as I mentioned before, that's the appellation the farthest south. It's right next to San Pablo Bay. It's a cooler area. Chardonnay loves this area. Produces really bright aromatics like banana, like cantaloupe, and really zippy acidity down there. And then we balance that out then from grapes grown up on Atlas Peak. So Atlas Peak is a mountain appellation directly up above Stag's Leap, so at about 1,500 feet of elevation. So as I mentioned, with mountain areas, they're unique because they do tend to be above the fog, but they're at elevation. So due to the elevation, they don't get quite as hot up there, at least during this day. They tend to stay a little bit warmer at night. but there's a lot more sunlight up there because they're out of fog for the most part. So Chardonnay up there has more of a like a lemon and lime aroma and a little bit of a richer, flintier characteristic. So those are the different characters that I'm trying to capture with Caria. This is a barrel fermented Chardonnay. I'll barrel ferment about 90% of this wine in French oak barrels, of which about a third are new. So I do want this one. I think, you know, if you're using the right wood and the right amount, it does add a little bit of complex. I want the oak to add complexity to the wine without being like the dominating factor. So you should pick up a little bit of clove, a little bit of vanilla, a little bit of toast coming from the wood, but hopefully you're able to also pick out those fruit characteristics, the floral notes, the honeysuckle, white peach, the apple and the cantaloupe notes that are really coming from the area. The wine, again, I want to bottle this so that the finish of the wine is complete, complex, has a lot of lingering flavors, has nice, bright, natural acidity, but isn't too over the top. It isn't a weighty Chardonnay. It's not a real buttery style of Chardonnay. It's something that I really want to have to be complete and complex so that, again, you can enjoy it on its own. Or this is a great wine with scallops. This is a great wine with cod. Some of the fishes that are kind of have a little bit of that kind of like sweeter aroma. You can also put this though with chicken, pork tenderloin. It's got enough weight that you should be able to pair it just fine with something like that as well. All right. Any questions on the Chardonnay?
We got a couple of comments. So I see the oak impact scale that you had back there. So is that intentional again, or is this something you understand the season and the weather and kind of go, okay, this is where I need to head with this? Tell us a little bit about that.
I guess I can't see where the oak impact thing is on this thing. It's just down below my.
Looks like it's
below my
two bars out of 5. If I'm reading
No,
that.
well, like I said, I mean, Chardonnay. There's many different styles of Chardonnay, and obviously, like any other variety, I mean, the grapes have the biggest impact. And I want to highlight the flavors of the grapes, right? The flavors of the area. And so wood is it's a useful component to help elevate. You want to use the right barrels that help to elevate the flavors of the area and add complexity. But I don't want the wood to be the overriding factor. If the first thing you smelled when you smelled Caria was toasty oak, then I'm off the mark. That's not what I want. I want you guys to describe the flavors of our vineyards, and that's what I want to be the first thing. But barrels are very useful. They're the most important thing in winemaking is grapes. The second most important thing in winemaking is how we ferment, and the third most important part of winemaking is cooperage and the use thereof. Maybe the best example is not Chardonnay, but is with Cabernet Sauvignon and our 2 estate vineyards. So I described for you guys earlier the flavors of Fay and the flavors of SLV. They're different. And so for me as a winemaker, I also use different barrels with those 2 vineyards because they have different flavors and different characters. The different coopers that we use, I mean, wood and woodworking and how these barrels are made, it's really complicated. And it really starts just like with grapes, where the trees are grown in France and how quickly they grow or how slow they grow. Are they in a warm climate, a cold climate? That has important impacts to the wood. And then the barrels, then they're purchased, they're split. Those logs then are aged outside in the weather for 2 to 3 years before they're brought into the cooperage to be bent, and then to be toasted on the inside. So barrel making is very complex, but it's a very component to winemaking. And so I have to keep an eye on the coopers that we use, and I have to understand what the flavors are that those barrels are going to give, and then marry the right barrels with the right wines so that they bring out more characteristic of the fruit and add a little bit of complexity as well.
Perfect. One last quick question before we head on to the cab. Why is the Caria Chard appears to be like a darker bottle? Someone asked a question about that, but I had the same impression. Is that just the glass tint or?
Yeah, it's just the glass tint. I mean, that's a pretty traditional Flint green. Of course, I'm colorblind. Bottle. I mean, that you'll find a lot of other Chardonnays or Burgundies in. You know, Sauvignon Blanc, you tend to see that in clear glass, just traditionally. Yeah, that kind of dark green bottle is what you'll find. I mean, Chardonnay probably has a little bit more of a variability into the color of the glass, maybe than a lot of other varieties, and then Cabernets tend to be in a darker bottle. But a lot of that is really just tradition, as opposed to like there's a real reason for why we want to put it in a certain color bottle.
Perfect. Thank you.
And then there's the marketing geniuses, yeah, that come up with the package and all that stuff, which we try to stay as far away from as possible. All right, so on to the Cabernet. So Artemis, goddess of the hunt. She's the protector of the stag. So very relevant for obviously the deer on the label, very relevant for the winery, but for the wine as well. You know, this is really meant to be a hunt around Napa Valley. You know, we've been talking, or I've been talking to you about the diversity of the area, the diversity of the soils where the grapes are grown. And with Cabernet Sauvignon here, it's one thing that is really cool. I mean, you have different, aside from, let's say, the different quality, let's say that you might have a favorite Cabernet, whether it's coming from Stag's Leap or St. Helena or Howell Mountain, but the different characteristics and the different personalities that you see in Cabernet Sauvignon grown here, it's pretty amazing. And that's really what we're trying to capture then with Artemis. I'm trying to produce you know, the finest example of a Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon for the season. So along with grapes then from Stag's Leap, which again, as I said, has got that real soft power characteristic. We own a vineyard up in Calistoga, and we work with some family growers in Calistoga and St. Helena and Oakville. So these are areas that again are warmer areas. So what you see in the northern appellated vineyards is you see more dark fruit, right? There's more sunlight up there. Soils are healthy. So you see more dark fruit characteristics in the aromas and flavors, and beautiful, soft, ripe, silky tannin. So we work with grapes from there. We also then, on the other extreme, we source vineyards from, we own a vineyard in the Woodland Valley, which is in the southern part of Napa. Warren, the Arcadia vineyard that I described, that has that really interesting Chardonnay. He also grows Cabernet Sauvignon for Artemis there. So this is also a cooler appellation for Cabernet Sauvignon. And Cabernets grown in the southern part of the valley, or in these kind of cooler pockets, take on more red fruit, like red currant, maybe more of like a tea leaf characteristic, and have like brighter acidity, brighter structure. And then we also work with fruit from mountain areas then, like again, up on Atlas Peak, and mountain areas where that Chardonnay, I said, gets more sunlight up there. It's got more lemony, limey character. Cabernet grown in mountain areas has a more wild characteristic to it. It has a little bit more of like a sage, huckleberry, brambly fruit, and bigger, broader tannins and big structure. So that's what I'm trying to capture then together in Artemis. This is primarily Cabernet Sauvignon. I mean, there's a little bit of Malbec, a little bit of Petit Verdot. Some years I'll use a little bit of Merlot, but you guys are tasting 18, so I think this is like 97% Cabernet Sauvignon, primarily Cab Sauv. I'll keep this wine in barrels for about 18 months or so, about 45% new oak. A little bit of American oak is part of that, but primarily French oak. And as I described, you guys are tasting 18, I believe, right? Or you guys have 18, right? So as I described for the vintage of for whites, you know, again, we're very excited about that, but then we're like, okay, we need a long growing season to get the freaking Cabernet right. And that is what we had. So you had both this kind of cool middle of the season and then a long end of the season. So for the wine then, what that did for Cabernets here is you have kind of the best of both worlds. The 1918 reds are very aromatic wines. That red and black fruit should just jump out at you in the glass. But when you taste the 18s, when you have that long growing season like that, you get the tannins fully ripe. So they're rich wines, they're lingering wines, they're lasting wines, but the tannins aren't necessarily like grippy or you know, rustic. They're ripe, rich, long lasting tannins. So really a great vintage for Napa, cooler vintage for Napa, but a long growing season. And I'm pretty excited about the 18s.
How do you see this one aging, and how does that differ from year to year? My understanding is it's mainly on the type of winemaking and the quality. You guys are obviously known for being top notch on those categories. So do all of your Cabernets age the same, or could that be different year to year?
Well, they could change. I mean, every year is going to be a little bit different, but for sure, ageability to me is a very important part of our wine. I know, like with our estate wines, you know, I often told by folks how they're saving a bottle for their kid's 21st birthday or a special wedding anniversary, and our wines have a history of being very ageable, and I take it very, very personally. And our wines damn well better deliver when somebody brings it out for a special occasion. You know, ageability is a tricky subject, though, and I think it's really defined by the site. You know, the grapes from certain areas, if they have more natural acidity, they may tend to have better potential to be made in a style that's ageable. And like for these wines, like for Artemis, that's where the key is for ageability for this. You know, I was taught by Piero Antinori the lesson that a wine does not need to be undrinkable in its youth in order to be ageable. And he's right. I've seen it over and over again. Remember, as wines age, you know, the tannins, so the bitter components soften, but so does the fruit. And so if with the time of bottling, if those two components aren't in that right balance, whether it's on the more elegant side, but they're together, or the more powerful side and they're together, you want them to be together so that as the wine ages, they both age together. I mean, the whole point of aging wine is that when it's better when you open it than it was in its youth. But to get that, you know, if you have a bottle of wine that's really tannic, it doesn't have a lot of fruit, and then you age it for 25 years, and 25 years from now, yeah, the tannins are going to be less, but the fruit's going to be gone. So is it a better wine? No. It's still a tannic wine that has no fruit. So, you know, I really try with these wines to have that right. And balance is a word that's kind of being overworked right now in the wine industry, but it is true. It has enough fruit and enough stuffing so that as that wine ages, it'll age together. We handle the wines here. That's the third. I said the site, then the style, and then the cellar is the third biggest key to ageability. That's both how we have handled the wines here, and also how you handle the wines when you're at home. You know, for our end anyway, you know, I want our wines to age. I keep our cellars here freaking cold, so that the wines age very, very slowly here. I try to find the right balance between fruit and tannin at bottling. You know, we have the latest bottling equipment to try to really capture everything that we want to capture, and then hope that, you know, you guys have kept it in a nice temperature controlled storage. You know, Artemis, as part of the 50th anniversary of the winery last year, that was a great excuse to open a bunch of older library wines. We're starting to sell some of our library through the wine shop here. And, you know, even Artemis, you know, it's some of the first vintages bottled again, 2001, tasting those wines have aged very gracefully. They're really nice wines. And so I'm very confident in today's wines that they also would have great potential for ageability as well.
That's great. I wanted to, with this picture on the screen, as we kind of get towards the end and open up, you know, everyone else is welcome to join in for some Q&A here. But these estate vineyard wines, you know, your kind of specialty and very exclusive wines, you know, we've actually featured all three of them during the Christmas season last year. We had some clients that used these for their high-end client customers, you know, and holiday gifts, which was fantastic for us and for you guys. But what really stands out about them to you? You know, what do you think are some of the easy, distinct differences, you know, of these three here?
Sure. Well, first with Fay and SLV, those wines that are on the outside, I mean, those are single vineyards from those properties. I kind of mentioned the really awesome thing about those two wines is just they both capture Stag's Leap District Cabernet, that soft power, the complexity, but they have a different personality. And you really see personality in the vineyard, I think, when you taste both older vintages and younger vintages. So, and that's what's neat. Like with Fay, you open up, 1993, 1995 Fay, and the first thing you get is that perfumey note and that bright berry pie that if you were to open a bottle of 2017 or 2018 Fay, that's the same character that you're going to get. And the same thing with SLV. SLV has this dusty cocoa powder. It has some of these like undescribable dark fruit characteristics, this graphite and black currant, and that is the characters that you see in the older wines as well as in the young wines. So they each have a very distinctly different personality that persists. That's what to me makes a vineyard really special, is if it has its own personality, and those two vineyards certainly do. They both also, as far as ageability goes, it's really fun to taste through library wines. And we have obviously a much deeper cellar with SLV because we've been producing wines from there since 1972. Cask 23, the first vintage of that wine was produced in 1974. What happened is that, so Warren, Bernarski, and he had a consultant named Andrei Telechev who was consulting for him at the time. Andrei actually had his hand in a lot of Napa Valley wineries, or in the development in terms of quality for Napa Valley wineries. And they were tasting through all the barrels of SLV. Remember, Fay doesn't become part of our winery until the mid 80s. And they came across a barrel that they thought was so superior in terms of quality that it warranted being bottled on its own. So they did, and they named it after the barrel number, or the cask number that it was being aged in. So it was being aged in cask number 23. So that's the name they gave to it. So it was like a reserve bottling of SLV. And so when it was bottled, it wasn't necessarily bottled every year. That's what it was up until 1990. Again, the Fay Vineyard became part of Stag's Leap Wine Cellars in the mid 80s. It largely needed to be replanted. And so starting in 1990, then cask changed to be really what it is about today. Cask is about complexity. You have these two vineyards side by side, but they have a different personality. So we try to capture all of those characteristics in cask. So both the perfumey, bright berry notes, but also the cocoa powder and currants. But cask is really a wine about intensity as well. And I don't necessarily mean that word meaning more tannic, more bitter. I mean richer and longer. What really, I think, takes a wine to the next level is the finish, the aftertaste. And I want the finish of this wine just to sit in your mouth, linger, and last for minutes. You want to come back and taste that wine again and again. Cask for us really starts out in the field. We have certain blocks out here that we do some certain different things to, areas that are very special and make the best quality wines from each of those vineyards. And then I'll look to make a selection of the barrels and put the wine physically together before the next harvest, so that it can age together harmoniously for the second year before bottling.
Wow, thank you,
Marcus. This has been fabulous. We're probably nearing the end of our time. We had some great comments, and so just in closing here real quick, Marcus and Guy, thank you for putting this together. It's been fantastic. We have an order form in case anybody's interested in any of the wines that we have here. There's a lot of options to buy wines out there. Vino Coteria is about providing a wine experience, and hopefully we delivered on that today. And so thank you all very much. We have an event like this once a month, so we'll make sure you're on the invite list. We also have member events at the end of every month, the last Friday of the month. Come to our showroom and taste those wines. We'll make sure y'all get invitations to those. Again, it's about creating that experience. And thank y'all very much. Guy Young, thank you for putting this together. And unless there's any more questions, we will call this a wrap with great thanks to everyone. Marcus, thank you.
thank you so much, Marcus.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. That was an
Cheers.
amazing presentation. Cheers.
Cheers. See you in Napa.
Exactly.
See you soon. Yeah, we'll be there in a few months, man. We'll talk before then.
Sounds good.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.